A worn-out $2 notebook was the only thing that made millionaire superstar Shaquille O'Neal freeze in his tracks in front of a 72-year-old man. It happened on a quiet Monday at an old truck driving school outside Shreveport, Louisiana. Shaq pulled in just to ask for directions. He had no idea he was about to meet Terrence, the man who taught him to drive a truck back in 1992. But this story is not just about a sports superstar and an old teacher. The school owed $38,500 after a business partner ran off with all the investment money last year. There was a promise made in the summer of 1992 that never got answered. And there was a secret handwritten notebook that Terrence had kept hidden for 32 years. Then 5 giant trucking companies showed up in the parking lot the very next day. What happened next will change the way you think about compassion. And the way Shaq quietly paid back a 32-year-old debt is something you will never guess. It was 10:14 on a Monday morning. Cold rain fell over the outskirts of Shreveport, Louisiana. The sky hung low and gray. It looked like a wet blanket pressed over the pine trees. Inside a black Ford F-650, a giant of a man leaned forward. He squinted hard at his GPS screen. The screen had gone dark 10 minutes earlier. It refused to come back on. Shaquille O'Neal was lost. He stood 7 feet 1 inch tall. He weighed 325 pounds. His shoulders nearly touched both sides of the cab. Even his own truck felt small around him today. He had driven this stretch of road before. But the storm had washed out every landmark he remembered. He passed a faded billboard for a restaurant that closed years ago. He passed an old gas station with broken windows. The wipers struggled against the heavy rain, barely keeping the windshield clear for more than a second at a time. Shaq leaned closer to the glass, trying to make out road signs through the gray blur. His schedule for the day had no room in it for getting lost, but here he was anyway. Nothing looked right. He tapped the dead screen twice, with one huge finger. He hoped it would blink back to life. It didn't. Up ahead, through the gray sheets of rain, he spotted a cracked lot. A wooden sign leaned to one side, half buried in tall grass. The white paint had peeled away in long curling strips. It read Lafayette Truck Driving School. Weeds pushed up through the broken pavement in thick clumps. An old chain-link fence sagged along one side of the lot. It looked like a place time had simply forgotten. Shaq pulled his truck through the open gate. His tires splashed through a wide puddle near the entrance. He figured someone inside could point him toward the interstate. He cut the engine and sat there for a second. Rain hammered steadily on the roof above him. Shaq had spent years learning to read a room before he ever walked into it. Back when he played basketball, people stared at him everywhere he went. Strangers asked for autographs in grocery stores. Kids pointed and whispered. He learned early that being noticed all the time gets tiring fast. These days, he liked quiet places. He liked small towns where nobody expected a superstar to show up. A broken-down truck school in the rain seemed like exactly that kind of place. He stepped out into the cold. Wet pine branches hung low over the gravel, heavy with rainwater. Shaq had to duck his head just to walk underneath them. He always ducked. He always folded himself smaller wherever he went. He was careful never to bump a door frame or knock something off a shelf. It was a habit built over a lifetime of being too big for most rooms. The school office sat inside an old metal shipping container. It was painted a dull army green, faded almost to gray. A dim yellow light glowed behind a cracked window. Shaq walked toward it slowly. Water ran off the brim of his cap and down his neck. Before he reached the door, he heard raised voices spilling out into the storm. Inside, a man in a sharp gray suit slammed a folder down on a metal desk. The sound cracked through the small room like a gunshot. His name was Marcus Vance. He worked for a company called Redwood Financial. "You owe $38,517.42, Vance said. His voice was flat and cold. It sounded like he was reading numbers off a grocery receipt. "You have until 4 o'clock Friday. After that, the bank takes the property." An older man stood behind the desk. His shoulders sagged under an old flannel shirt. His hands were folded tight in front of him, knuckles pale. He didn't argue. He just stared down at the folder like it was an open wound. Vance didn't wait for an answer. He snapped his briefcase shut. He turned sharply and walked straight out the door. He brushed right past Shaq, without even looking up. He climbed into a black sedan and drove off fast, tires throwing up muddy water across the lot. Vance was not a cruel man by nature. He managed 40 accounts for Redwood Financial, and Lafayette was just one small file in a stack on his desk. His bosses measured him by numbers, not by faces. He had learned long ago that hesitation in this job got you replaced. Rules were rules, and exceptions made his quarterly reports look bad. He told himself that every single time he drove away from a place like this one. Shaq stood in the doorway for a second. Rain dripped steadily from his jacket onto the concrete floor. He almost turned around to leave. He didn't want to interrupt whatever had just happened in that small room. Then the older man lifted his head and looked straight at him. "Help you with something, son?" the man asked. His voice was low and gravelly. It sounded worn down by decades of shouting over loud engines. Something about that voice hit Shaq hard, like a truck slamming into a wall. He knew that voice. He had heard it bark orders at him 32 years ago. Back then he was just a scared teenager trying not to mess things up. "Terrence," Shaq said quietly. He was almost afraid to say the name out loud. The old man squinted hard. He studied the massive figure standing in his doorway, soaking wet and ducking under the low ceiling. Recognition crept slowly across his weathered face. First confusion, then disbelief, then something close to shock. "Shaquille O'Neal," Terrence whispered, shaking his head slowly. "Lord have mercy, just look at you now." 32 years had passed since the two of them last stood together like this. Back then, Shaq was a nervous 19-year-old at LSU. He was terrified that one bad fall on the court could end everything he had worked for. His mother had told him to learn something useful with his hands, just in case. Terrence had taught him to drive an 18-wheeler that summer. He was patient and strict in equal measure. He never raised his voice unless Shaq truly deserved it. Now here they stood again, decades later, in a different kind of storm. Shaq's mind raced. He had walked in only looking for directions. Instead, he had walked straight into the middle of a stranger's nightmare. The man who had quietly shaped a piece of his life was about to lose everything he had built. "I heard what that man said," Shaq told him, stepping further inside. Water pooled at his boots on the worn floor. "Let me write you a check right now. Right here, this second. I'll cover every dollar of it." Terrence's jaw tightened. Color rushed up into his weathered cheeks. "I don't take charity from strangers," he said sharply, almost spitting the word out. "Not even big ones like you, son." For a second, Shaq almost pushed back. He had the money sitting right there in his account, more than enough to erase this man's troubles in 30 seconds flat. Part of him wanted to argue. That pride was a poor trade for a roof and 4 walls. But another part of him, the part raised by a mother who refused handouts her whole life, understood exactly why Terrence wouldn't bend. The room went quiet except for rain tapping steadily on the metal roof. A single drip fell from a leak in the corner. It hit an old coffee can with a soft, hollow ping over and over again. Shaq didn't argue back. He didn't raise his voice or push harder. Instead, he reached over and pulled a hard plastic chair away from the wall. He lowered himself into it slowly. He folded his huge frame down until his eyes were level with Terrence's. He didn't want to loom over this man like some giant stranger. He wanted to look like a person, not a tower. "Summer of 1992, Shaq said, his voice softer now. "Newark was hard back then. My family didn't have much money at all. I was playing ball down at LSU. He paused for a moment before going on. "Every single night, I lay awake worrying I'd blow out a knee and lose everything I had." Terrence's eyes narrowed slightly, but he was listening closely now. His arms slowly uncrossed. "You told me something I never forgot," Shaq went on. "You said this steering wheel would feed my family if that orange ball ever stopped bouncing. Then you made me back this truck into a tight little space for 4 straight hours in the heat. You wouldn't let me stop until I got it perfect." Terrence's hard expression cracked just slightly at the edges. His eyes turned glassy and wet. His weathered hands trembled, just a little, resting against the edge of the desk. Without a word, he turned and pulled open an old rusted file cabinet drawer. The metal screeched loudly against itself, stiff from years of damp Louisiana air. Inside, buried beneath stacks of yellowed paperwork, he found a small leather notebook. Its cover had gone soft, and worn from decades of handling. He had bought it for $2 at a drugstore, long before Shaq had ever played a single college basketball game. He flipped slowly through the brittle pages. His thick fingers moved, with surprising care for such rough hands. He stopped at July 1992. His finger landed on a single handwritten line. The ink faded to a dull brown. Shaquille O'Neal. Big as a barn, but he listens. The two men sat in silence for a long moment. 32 years collapsed down into a single quiet breath shared between them. You remembered, Terrence said softly, almost talking only to himself. I never forgot, Shaq answered. Not 1 second of it, not once in all these years. Even with that bridge rebuilt between them, Terrence did not soften on his rule. He closed the notebook gently and set it down on the desk, treating it like something sacred. I'm proud of what you've become, he said. Real proud, truly. But Lafayette doesn't take money for nothing in return. It never has, not in 30 years. Shaq nodded slowly. He understood completely. This man had survived his whole life on pride and hard work. Nothing was ever handed to him for free. A check with no strings attached would feel less like help and more like an insult. Then let me pay you properly, Shaq said. I want to sign up for a 3-day refresher course. Heavy truck handling, the real thing, start to finish. I'll pay your top rate, and I want you to teach it yourself. Terrence rubbed his chin, thinking it over. Top rate is $400 a day. That's steep for some basketball player. I can afford steep, Shaq said, the corner of his mouth twitching toward a smile. Terrence studied him for a long moment. He searched Shaq's face carefully for any trace of pity. He found none at all. Just respect, plain and steady, the same respect from 32 years ago. All right, Terrence said finally, the corner of his mouth almost curling into a smile. 3 days. My price, not yours. And you'll sweat for every minute of it, just like everybody else. That afternoon, Shaq folded his massive body into the cab of an old 1989 Peterbilt. It was parked behind the office building. The bench seat groaned loudly under his weight. His knees pressed hard against the dashboard. The diesel engine coughed twice, then roared fully to life. It rattled the thin windows of the container office nearby. The cab smelled like diesel and old leather, with a faint trace of pine air freshener clipped to the vent. Gauges with cracked glass faces lined the dashboard, their needles trembling slightly with the idle engine. Outside, rain streaked down the windshield in long gray lines. For the first time in decades, Shaquille O'Neal was a student again. He sat behind that cracked steering wheel. He listened to Terrence bark instructions just like he had back in 1992. Something deep inside Shaq settled quietly into place. Over the next 2 days, Terrence drilled him hard. They worked on backing into tight spaces. They worked on checking mirrors. They worked on reading the road like a second language. Shaq stalled the engine twice on the first day. By the second day, he barely made a single mistake. You always were stubborn, Terrence said, watching Shaq line up the trailer for another pass. Stubborn enough to get it right eventually. Learned that from somebody, Shaq said, eyes fixed on the side mirror. Terrence almost laughed, a short dry sound he hadn't made in a long while. He walked alongside the slow-moving truck, calling out small corrections. Turn the wheel a touch more. Ease off the brake. Watch that back corner. Shaq listened to every word, the same way he had at 19, hungry to get it right. That first evening, after the lesson ended, Terrence walked Shaq around the small lot. He pointed out every truck the school still owned. There were only 3 left. All of them were old. All of them were patched together, with spare parts and stubbornness. Terrence talked about each one like it was family. He never once complained about money. He just stated facts, plain and steady, the way a man talks about weather he can't control. You built all this yourself? Shaq asked, looking around at the sagging fence and cracked pavement. Every bit of it, Terrence said. Brick by brick, mile by mile. Shaq said nothing more about it that night, but he was already thinking hard about what he could do. And quietly, without telling Terrence a single word, Shaq had already begun planning how to save this little school from disappearing forever. The next morning, Shaq arrived early. He parked his truck near the fence before his lesson started. Inside the lot, another student was finishing her own lesson. She was carefully backing a trailer between 2 orange cones. Her name was Clara Jenkins. Clara was 29 years old. She was raising 2 kids on her own. She worked the overnight shift at a truck stop diner just to keep the lights on. After paying her course deposit weeks earlier, her bank account held exactly $17.42. She still owed $2,415.50 to finish her training. She was, as it turned out, the very last student left at Lafayette. Shaq watched her finish the backing exercise, hitting the mark almost perfectly on her first try. "You're good at this," he said. Clara wiped rain off her face and shrugged. "Had to be. 3 jobs don't leave room for being bad at things." She nodded toward the trailer she had just parked. "This one pays better than the diner ever could. Steady hours, too. My kids could actually see me on weekends for once." "If this place closes Friday," Clara told Shaq quietly, wiping grease from her hands with an old rag, "I lose my deposit. And I lose my shot at a CDL." She glanced toward the road, her jaw tight with worry. "That license was supposed to get my kids out of that trailer park for good." Shaq said nothing right away. Her words settled deep in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He knew that particular fear well. He had grown up surrounded by it back in Newark. "My grandfather drove trucks for 30 years, Clara said, glancing at the old Peterbilt. "Used to tell me the road don't care who you are. It only cares if you're ready for it." "Sounds about right," Shaq said, nodding slowly. "You scared?" Clara asked suddenly, studying his face. "Big man like you, worried about an old truck school in the middle of nowhere?" Shaq thought about the question honestly before answering. "Scared of watching good people lose something they earned," he said. "Been there before. Don't like the feeling." Clara nodded, like that answer made sense to her more than most things people said these days. Tuesday afternoon brought another storm, and this one wasn't just rain. Marcus Vance returned to the lot around 2 o'clock. This time he walked beside a state inspector named Diane Robles, clipboard tucked under one arm. It turned out that Arthur Higgins, the school's former business partner, had vanished months earlier. He took every last dollar of investment money with him. Before disappearing, he had quietly forged maintenance records on the old Peterbilt. He wanted to cut corners and pocket extra cash. Terrence had trusted Higgins for nearly 6 years, ever since the man first walked into the lot promising to help modernize the business. Higgins talked a good game about growth and new contracts. Looking back, Terrence realized he had wanted to believe those promises so badly that he stopped asking hard questions. That trust was the real debt nobody could write a check to cover. Inspector Robles circled the truck slowly. She checked the hoses, the brake lines, and the tire treads with a careful eye. Terrence stood off to the side, arms crossed tight over his chest. He was trying hard to look calm. He was not calm at all. "How long has this truck been on the road?" Robles asked, kneeling to check the tread depth on the front tire. "Since 1989, Terrence answered. "Maintained it myself, every month, like clockwork." Robles nodded but kept looking. She pulled a small flashlight from her belt and shined it under the frame, moving slowly along each line and hose. "Place looks well kept, all things considered," she added, almost to herself. She glanced at the swept floor and the neatly hung tools along the garage wall. Terrence allowed himself a small nod of thanks, though his eyes stayed fixed on her flashlight beam. Then Robles crouched down beside the front wheel and frowned. She ran her gloved finger along a thin, wet streak on the cold metal. "This brake line is leaking," she said, glancing up sharply. "High-pressure hydraulic fluid, right here. This is dangerous, Mr. Terrence. I cannot let this truck operate like this." Terrence's shoulders dropped, like someone had cut a string holding him upright. He reached slowly for a pen sitting on the desk. He was ready to sign a voluntary closure form that Vance had already typed up. That was the exact moment Shaq stepped forward. "Give us 24 hours, he said, his voice calm and steady. "Let us fix it properly. Let us get it re-inspected before anyone signs anything final. I'll personally guarantee the repair gets done right." Robles studied him for a long moment. She glanced over at the old truck, then at the tired old man standing quietly beside it. 9 o'clock Wednesday morning, she said at last, closing her clipboard. Not 1 minute later than that. That night, the garage filled with the smell of wet concrete, diesel fuel, and old motor oil. Rain leaked steadily through a gap in the roof. It dripped into a rusted metal bucket sitting in the corner. Shaq, Terrence, and Clara worked side by side under a single hanging light bulb. The bulb swayed gently every time wind gusted outside. Shaq's enormous hands were normally clumsy around anything small, but he carefully steadied the new brake line, while Terrence guided the wrench. The replacement part cost $142.80. Shaq paid for it in cash, straight from his own wallet. Terrence didn't argue this time. Clara held a flashlight steady under the truck. Her arms ached after hours of standing in one place. "Why are you really doing all this?" she finally asked Shaq, her voice quiet over the dripping rain. "You could have just driven off Monday morning and forgot this place ever existed." Shaq thought about it for a moment before answering. "Somebody once gave me 4 hours of his patience when I didn't deserve it," he said. "Felt about time I gave some back." Around midnight, Terrence stopped working for a minute. He wiped sweat and rain from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He looked over at Shaq, then at Clara, then back down at the truck. "Used to do this kind of work alone," he said quietly. "Forgot how much faster it goes with extra hands." He paused, staring at the wrench in his palm. 30 years I ran this place solo. Told myself that was strength. Maybe it was just stubbornness wearing a different coat. Nobody answered him right away. Clara shifted the flashlight beam, and Shaq kept his grip steady on the brake line. The rain kept falling outside. The work kept going. While Terrence focused on tightening the last fitting, Shaq slipped quietly outside under the dripping eaves. He pulled out his phone. He made call after call in the dark. He spoke low and fast to old business contacts across the trucking industry. He never once mentioned charity or pity. He talked about opportunity. He talked about training programs. He talked about dependable drivers ready to work. "I need 5 minutes," Shaq said, into the phone, voice low under the dripping rain. "There's a school down here that trains drivers better than anybody I've seen. Trustworthy people, the kind you don't find easy anymore." He listened for a moment, then answered the question on the other end. "No strings. Just send somebody to look at the place yourself before Friday. That's all I'm asking." By 2 in the morning, the brake line was finally fixed, tight and dry, no more leaking. And Shaq's quiet plan, set in motion through those late-night calls, was already rolling forward fast. Wednesday morning arrived gray and tired, the rain finally easing into a light drizzle. At 8:15, just 45 minutes before the inspection deadline, Marcus Vance pulled back into the lot. This time he was trailing a tow truck close behind him. He stepped out holding a fresh stack of paperwork. He demanded that Terrence sign the property over right then, no matter what had been agreed the day before. "You agreed to a Wednesday inspection," Terrence said, his voice shaking slightly, but somehow still holding firm. "That deal still stands, Mr. Vance." "Deals change," Vance said coldly. He waved the tow operator forward to start hooking chains onto the school's training trailer. Terrence's hands trembled as Vance shoved the clipboard toward him. A pen was already clicked open in his other hand. Clara stood frozen by the office door, watching everything she had worked for slip slowly through her fingers. Terrence looked down at the pen in his hand. He looked over at the truck, freshly repaired, dry and safe under the morning light. He looked at Clara, then at the empty road behind Vance's tow truck. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually sign. "Don't," Clara whispered, barely loud enough to hear. Terrence's hand hovered over the paper, pen pressed against the blank line. Somewhere down the highway, though nobody in that lot could hear it yet, 5 heavy engines were already closing in fast. Seconds stretched out long and heavy. A drop of rainwater rolled off the office roof and landed on the clipboard, smearing one corner of the ink. Vance tapped his foot against the wet gravel, impatient, checking his watch for the 3rd time in a minute. Terrence's pen touched paper. Then, at exactly 8:47, a deep mechanical roar shook the entire parking lot. It rattled the loose windows of the old container office. 5 massive late-model semi-trucks rolled in together. Their engines thundered. Their air brakes hissed loudly as they lined up in a wide curve across the muddy lot. Bold company logos covered each set of doors: Titan Overland, Vanguard Freight, Ironclad Logistics, Apex Carrier, and Summit Hauling. Doors opened one after another. drivers and company representatives stepped down onto the wet gravel, boots splashing in the puddles. They moved with purpose, like they had rehearsed this moment, though none of them had. Diesel exhaust hung in the cold morning air, mixing with the smell of fresh rain. Vance spun around, completely stunned. The clipboard nearly slipped from his fingers onto the wet ground. A sharply dressed woman stepped down from the lead truck. She carried a thick leather folder and a single cashier's check tucked inside a clear envelope. She was Shaq's attorney. She walked straight toward Vance, with steady, unhurried steps. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement. She held the check out to him, without saying a word. $38,517.42. Paid in full. It cleared the school's entire debt in one single instant. Vance's face drained pale white. His mouth opened, then closed again. No words came out at all. There was nothing left for him to say to anyone standing there. He waved the tow operator off. He turned and backed slowly toward his car. He climbed inside, without another glance at Terrence or anyone else. The 5 trucking company executives gathered around Terrence. He stood frozen in place, struggling to fully understand what was unfolding right in front of his own eyes. One of them, a tall man in a Titan overland jacket, stepped forward first. "Mr. Terrence, my name is Gerald Banks. We've been looking for a training partner in this region for almost a year now." Terrence blinked, still holding the clipboard Vance had abandoned. "I don't understand," he managed to say. "Why us? Why this little lot?" "Because somebody we trust vouched for you," Banks said simply. "Said you turn out the most disciplined drivers in the South. That's worth more to us than a fancy building." The other 4 executives nodded in agreement, stepping forward one by one to introduce themselves and shake Terrence's trembling hand. Behind them, drivers from each company walked the small lot, nodding approvingly at the worn but well-maintained equipment lined up along the fence. They explained, one after another, that Lafayette Truck Driving School would now become their official regional training partner. The joint contract between all 5 companies came to $427,500 total. It secured the little school's future for years to come. Clara would receive a full scholarship to finish her CDL training completely. She would also get a guaranteed driving job waiting for her the very day she graduated. Terrence held the signed contract tightly in his shaking hands. Tears finally broke loose and ran freely down his weathered face. He turned, scanning the busy lot for the giant man who had wandered in just 3 days earlier. That man had been soaked from the rain, only looking for simple directions. The 5 executives shook Terrence's hand one after another. They were already talking about schedules, new students, and a fresh coat of paint for the office. Clara stood off to the side, hand pressed over her mouth, crying quietly into her sleeve. "He did this," Clara whispered, mostly to herself, watching the contracts get passed around. "He really did this, and he's not even sticking around to hear thank you." She thought back to Monday morning, when this giant stranger had first walked through the gate soaked from the rain. Nobody in that lot could have guessed how the week would end. 3 days ago, the school was days from closing for good. Now it had a future bigger than anyone there had dared imagine. None of them noticed the black Ford F-650 easing slowly toward the gate. But Shaq was already climbing back into his truck. It was parked quietly near the edge of the lot, far away from all the noise and celebration. He gave Terrence one last warm smile through the rain-streaked windshield. He gave him a simple wave goodbye. Nothing more needed to be said between them. Terrence finally spotted him just as the truck rolled past the broken fence. He raised a hand and held it there. He watched until the taillights disappeared around the bend in the road. Clara walked up beside him, still wiping her eyes. "He's not coming back, is he?" she asked. "Men like that don't need to," Terrence said. "They show up once, when it matters most, and that's enough." He looked down at the contract in his hands, then back toward the empty road one more time. The rain had finally stopped completely, and a thin strip of sunlight broke through the clouds over the pine trees. On the office desk behind him, sitting neatly in the very center, was the worn $2 notebook. It had been returned exactly where it had always belonged. Terrence picked it up and held it for a long moment. He didn't open it again. He simply slid it into his shirt pocket close to his chest. Then he walked back inside to start the next chapter of Lafayette truck driving school.